A woman observes a black man holding her handbag and instantly assumes he is attempting to steal it, causing her to spiral into a frenzy. Her anger escalates to the point where she uses pepper spray on him. But what happens next is something she could never have predicted. Marcus was heading home after a long day at work, strolling through the familiar park that offered a brief respite from the chaos of life. The golden rays of the setting sun bathed the area in warmth, while children laughed as they played tag. Joggers nodded in passing, and couples shared quiet moments together. The park, a sanctuary of simplicity, always seemed to rejuvenate him. As Marcus walked past a bench near the central fountain, something shiny caught his attention. A sleek black leather handbag rested there, seemingly forgotten. Its owner, however, was nowhere in sight. Marcus paused, glancing around to see if anyone seemed to be looking for it. His instincts told him to act, yet past experiences reminded him to proceed cautiously. He sighed, eventually picking up the purse by its strap to avoid any misinterpretation. "Excuse me," he called out to a passerby, but the man barely acknowledged him, continuing on his way. A jogger, too, glanced at him briefly before resuming her pace. Feeling the weight of his actions, Marcus stood there, scanning the surroundings once more. Finally, he noticed a woman at the edge of the park, pacing back and forth. Her blonde hair was tied back in a ponytail, and her body language was tense, hands gesturing wildly as though in frustration or panic. That must be her, Marcus thought. Hopeful that he had found the bag's rightful owner, he approached cautiously, the handbag dangling from his hand, to make his intentions clear. "Excuse me, ma'am," Marcus said when he was close enough to be heard. "I think this might be yours." The woman turned abruptly, her eyes zeroing in on the purse in his hand. Relief flashed across her face for the briefest moment, only to be quickly replaced by suspicion. "That's my bag," she barked, snatching it from his grasp without hesitation. "What were you doing with it?" Taken aback by her aggression, Marcus raised his hands in a gesture of surrender. "I found it on a bench," he explained. "I thought you might have—" "Don't you lie to me," she interrupted, clutching the purse tightly to her chest. Her voice was sharp, each word dripping with accusation. "You stole it, didn't you?" "What?" Marcus blinked, incredulous. "No, I didn't. I was just trying to help." "You expect me to believe that?" she shot back, her voice rising in pitch. Nearby, heads turned, and a few passers-by slowed their pace to observe. "I know what you were doing, probably rummaging through it to see what you could take." Marcus took a step back, his patience thinning. "Look," he said firmly but calmly, "I didn't even open it. I was just trying to return it to you." "Thief!" she spat, her voice echoing across the park and drawing even more attention. Sighing, Marcus glanced around at the growing crowd. He felt the weight of their stares as the tension thickened. The woman, who he now heard someone mutter was named Karen, clung to her purse as though it were a lifeline. Her face was a mixture of indignation and self-righteousness. "Ma'am," Marcus began, trying to maintain his composure, "I don't know what you think I was doing, but I assure you, I was only trying to do the right thing. I found your bag on the bench and brought it over." Karen scoffed, her expression hardening. "Do you think I'm stupid? You had no business touching my belongings. You're just upset because I caught you before you could get away with it." Marcus's jaw tightened. He glanced at the crowd, now consisting of a mother pulling a wagon, a jogger who had paused mid-stride, and a man with a cane shaking his head. "Caught me?" Marcus said, exasperated. "You didn't catch me doing anything. I was handing it back to you. Why would I stay here if I was trying to steal it?" Karen stepped closer, jabbing an accusing finger at his chest. "Because you wanted to play the hero. Act like the good guy, so no one would suspect you. I've seen this trick before." "Lady, I don't even know you," Marcus said, his tone flat with disbelief. "I was trying to help." "That's what they always say," she snapped, her voice climbing higher. "People like you think you can get away with anything." Marcus froze, her words striking him like a slap. "Excuse me?" he said, his tone sharp now. Karen's lips curled into a smug smile as murmurs rippled through the onlookers. "Oh, don't play dumb. You know exactly what I mean." "You're really going there?" Marcus asked, his voice edged with controlled anger. You're accusing me of stealing, sprinkling in stereotypes? And somehow you think that makes you right?" Her face turned crimson, though it wasn't clear if it was from fury or embarrassment. "I don't have to explain myself to you," she said, with finality. "I know a thief when I see one." Around them, whispers buzzed like static electricity. A young man discreetly aimed his smartphone at the scene, while the older man with the cane muttered under his breath, "Let the man speak, lady." Marcus turned to the onlookers, his frustration finally spilling over. "Does this make sense to anyone here? Why would I bring the purse back if I was trying to steal it?" "He's got a point," the young man with the phone said, loud enough for everyone to hear. Karen spun toward him, glaring. "Stay out of this. You don't know what he's capable of." "What I'm capable of," Marcus snapped, his voice rising. "Do you even hear yourself? All I did was try to help. And now you're turning this into a public spectacle." Karen clutched her purse even tighter. "You had no right to touch my property." "Who knows what you were planning?" Marcus let out a bitter laugh. "Next time, I'll just leave it where I found it. Maybe then you'll have someone real to accuse." The tension reached its peak as Karen raised her voice. "You're not going anywhere. I'm calling the police." Marcus's stomach dropped. "You're serious?" he asked, his voice laced with disbelief. "You're seriously calling the cops on me for trying to help you?" Marcus asked, incredulity lacing his tone. "Yes, I am," Karen replied, her hands fumbling with her phone. "Let them sort this out." "Good," Marcus said, folding his arms across his chest. "Maybe they'll have the sense to see how absurd this is." Karen dialed the number, her trembling fingers betraying her bravado. When the call connected, her words were sharp and deliberate. "Yes, officer, I need help. There's a man here who tried to steal my purse. He's being aggressive and I don't feel safe." Marcus's jaw tightened as he caught the murmurs from the growing crowd. Words like aggressive and unsafe weren't just descriptions. They were accusations with dangerous implications. A middle-aged woman pushing a stroller stepped forward, shaking her head. "I saw him pick it up and walk over to you. He didn't do anything wrong." "Stay out of this," Karen snapped, her voice trembling. "You don't know the whole story. I've got the whole thing on video," the young man with the smartphone interjected, raising his voice. "You're making a scene over nothing." Karen's head whipped toward him, her confidence faltering for the first time. "You what?" "That's right," he said, holding his phone up higher. "You're not going to twist this story." Marcus wiped a hand over his face, the weight of frustration threatening to break his composure. "This is unbelievable," he muttered, his voice barely containing his anger. "You just can't admit you're wrong, can you?" Karen's gaze darted between Marcus and the crowd, her bravado visibly slipping. "I don't care what any of you say," she spat, her voice unsteady. "I know what I saw, and the police will too." Marcus's patience snapped. His voice cut through the murmurs, sharp and resolute. "Lady, you're ridiculous. You're standing here accusing me of stealing when all I did was try to help you, and you still can't admit you were wrong." Karen's eyes widened in shock, her face flushing a deep crimson. "How dare you speak to me like that?" she shrieked, her voice trembling with indignation. "You think you can intimidate me? You don't scare me." "I'm not trying to scare you," Marcus retorted, stepping forward with conviction. "But maybe I should, considering how you're acting. You called me a thief for no reason, and treated me like garbage just because I tried to do the right thing." The murmurs of the crowd grew louder, a mixture of agreement and discomfort rippling through the bystanders. Phones were raised, capturing every escalating moment. "He's right," a young woman whispered to her friend. "She's completely losing it." Karen's grip tightened on the purse strap, her knuckles white. "Oh, don't play the victim now," she snapped. "I've seen your type before. You think you're so clever, but you're not fooling me." Marcus's anger boiled over. His voice echoed across the park. "You don't know a damn thing about me," he barked, his tone resolute and filled with frustration. "I've had enough of people like you, people who jump to conclusions and treat others like trash because of your narrow-minded nonsense." Karen flinched, momentarily thrown off balance, but quickly recovered, her expression twisting into one of fury. "People like me? No, it's people like you who think they can get away with anything." "Get away with what?" Marcus fired back, his voice rising even further. "Returning your stupid purse? I don't need anything from you, and I sure as hell didn't deserve this." Karen stumbled back a step, her eyes darting nervously to the captivated crowd. Her voice wavered but carried an edge of defiance. "You're not going to bully me!" she screamed, her hand diving into her purse. Marcus froze. "Wait! What are you doing?" Before he could react, Karen pulled out a small canister and pressed the nozzle, unleashing a stream of pepper spray directly into Marcus's face. He cried out in pain, stumbling backward and clawing at his burning eyes. "Are you kidding me?" he shouted, his voice raw and broken. "You just sprayed me! Are you out of your mind?" Gasps and shouts erupted from the crowd. "You're crazy!" someone yelled. "He didn't even touch her," another voice chimed in. Karen stood her ground, gripping the pepper spray canister tightly. Her voice trembled as she tried to defend herself. "He was being aggressive," she insisted, desperation seeping into her tone. "I felt threatened." Marcus dropped to his knees, tears streaming from his swollen eyes. "Threatened?" he choked out between coughs. "I was walking away." "You're unbelievable." A middle-aged woman rushed forward with a water bottle, crouching beside Marcus. "Here, try to flush it out," she said softly, her voice heavy with concern. "Don't rub your eyes. It'll make it worse." Karen pointed a shaking finger at the woman. "Stay back. You don't know what he's capable of." "Capable of what?" the young man with the smartphone demanded, stepping closer. "I've got the whole thing on video. You just attacked him for no reason." Karen's face twisted, panic flickering in her eyes. "That's not true," she shot back, her voice climbing higher. "He was threatening me. You didn't see the way he came at me." "I saw the whole thing," another bystander shouted. "He didn't do anything but argue with you after you called him a thief." Marcus struggled to his feet, his eyes still streaming. His voice, hoarse but loud, rang out over the chaos. "You're a coward, you know that?" he bellowed, his frustration and pain fueling every word. "You can't stand being wrong, so you'd rather double down and hurt someone who didn't do a damn thing to you." Karen shrank back slightly, her bravado cracking under the weight of the crowd's judgment. But her indignation flared once more. "Don't try to turn this on me!" she screamed. "You're the one who caused all this. You did this to yourself." Marcus shook his head, his voice raw but resolute. "You had the chance to just take your purse and leave. But no, you had to make me the bad guy. You couldn't handle the truth if it hit you in the face." The crowd's murmurs grew louder, a mixture of condemnation and disbelief swirling in the air. Phones captured every second, ensuring the moment would live on beyond the park. In the distance, the faint wail of sirens began to rise above the murmur of the crowd. Karen's head snapped toward the approaching sound, her expression flickering between relief and unease. "Good," she muttered, her voice trembling slightly. "Let the police handle this. They'll see what kind of person you really are." Marcus coughed, his chest still heaving from the burning pain of the pepper spray. "Yeah," he replied bitterly, his voice steady despite his discomfort. "Let's see how this works out for you." The sirens grew louder, the flashing red and blue lights of a patrol car reflecting off the curious, tense faces of the crowd. The vehicle rolled to a stop at the edge of the park, the sirens cutting off abruptly. The lights, however, continued to flicker, casting an ominous glow over the scene. An officer stepped out of the car, his gaze sweeping across the crowd before locking onto Marcus, who was still wiping his inflamed eyes, and then Karen, who stood stiffly, clutching the pepper spray canister like a lifeline. "What's going on here?" the officer demanded, his voice calm but commanding as he moved to the center of the commotion. Karen practically rushed forward, as though she had been rehearsing her account. "Thank goodness you're here, officer," she exclaimed, her tone a mix of urgency and indignation. "That man," she said, jabbing a finger in Marcus's direction, "tried to steal my purse. When I confronted him, he got aggressive. I had no choice but to defend myself." Marcus straightened, wincing at the pain still burning his face. His voice, hoarse but clear, carried his frustration. "That's not true," he said firmly. "I found her purse sitting on a bench and tried to return it to her. She accused me of stealing it, and then sprayed me for no reason." The officer raised a hand, silencing both parties. His sharp gaze moved between Karen's indignant posture and Marcus's visible discomfort. "All right," he said, his tone neutral. "Let's take a step back. Sir, you're saying you didn't steal the purse?" "That's right," Marcus said with conviction. "I didn't even open it. I saw it left behind on the bench, figured someone had forgotten it, and brought it to her." Karen let out a sharp, mocking laugh. "He's lying," she snapped, her voice dripping with derision. "He probably saw me set it down and waited for the right moment to grab it. I know how these types operate." Lo, Marcus's jaw tightened, his frustration bubbling over at her choice of words. "These types," he repeated, his voice rising. "You've been throwing out baseless accusations since I handed you your damn purse. You're the one who escalated this." "Ma'am," the officer interjected, his tone turning more serious. "Do you have any evidence that he was trying to steal your purse?" Karen faltered, momentarily at a loss, but quickly rallied. "Evidence? It was in his hands. What more do you need?" A voice rose from the crowd. "He was giving it back to you, lady," a bystander called out, their frustration evident. The officer turned toward the gathering onlookers. "Did anyone here see what happened?" A young man stepped forward, holding up his smartphone. "I've got the whole thing on video," he announced. He picked up the purse and walked straight over to her. She started yelling and then sprayed him when he didn't back down. Karen's face drained of color, but she quickly turned her glare on the young man. "You're going to take the word of some random guy with a camera?" she demanded, her voice trembling with indignation. "You don't know what he was planning to do. I felt unsafe. That's why I acted." Marcus, still blinking away the searing pain in his eyes, pointed a trembling hand in her direction. "Unsafe?" he repeated, his voice hoarse but cutting. "That's your excuse? You attacked me because I didn't cower to your ridiculous accusations." Karen's face hardened as she tightened her grip on the canister. "You were yelling at me. I thought you were going to hurt me." "You were yelling at him first," another voice from the crowd called out, slicing through the tension. The officer turned back to Karen, his expression now serious and resolute. "Ma'am," he said, his tone stern, "if what he's saying is true and you used pepper spray without cause, that's assault. And if you've misrepresented the situation to the police, that's filing a false report." Karen's eyes widened, panic flashing briefly before she doubled down. "This is absurd!" she exclaimed. "I'm the victim here. You don't understand how terrifying it was. He was towering over me, shouting. I had to protect myself." Marcus let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "You're unbelievable," he said, his voice steady despite his frustration. "I was standing there explaining myself, and you couldn't handle being wrong. You wanted me to look like the bad guy, so you could justify your actions." "Enough," the officer barked, silencing the escalating argument. He turned to the young man holding the phone. "Can I see the video?" The young man stepped forward, handing over his device. The officer watched the footage in silence, the sounds of Karen's accusations and Marcus's calm voice playing out for all to hear. When the clip reached the moment Karen unleashed the pepper spray, the officer's jaw tightened visibly. He handed the phone back, his gaze now cold and fixed on Karen. "Ma'am," he said, his voice flat and unwavering, "the video doesn't support your claims. It shows him returning your purse and you escalating the situation." Karen's confidence wavered, but she quickly snapped back, her voice rising in pitch. "You don't know what he was planning," she exclaimed, desperation creeping into her tone. "That video doesn't show the whole story." "It shows enough," the officer replied firmly. He turned to Marcus. "Sir, are you pressing charges?" Karen spun toward Marcus, her face twisted in a mix of fury and desperation. "You can't do this to me," she cried. "I was just trying to protect myself. You don't know how scared I was." Marcus met her gaze, his expression calm but resolute. "You weren't scared," he said, his voice steady. "You were looking for an excuse." The officer stepped between them, raising a hand to Karen. "That's enough. Ma'am, if you don't calm down, I'll have no choice but to take you into custody for assault." Karen's protests continued, her voice blending with the murmurs of the crowd as the weight of the moment bore down on her. The scene teetered on the brink of resolution, with every phone in the crowd recording the climax of her unraveling. The tension in the air felt nearly suffocating as neither Karen nor Marcus showed any signs of backing down. The officer's expression was unreadable, His next move weighed carefully as Karen's panic, fury, and disbelief collided into a whirlwind of raw emotion. Her knuckles had turned white, gripping the pepper spray canister like a lifeline, the black plastic contrasting starkly against her trembling hands. "This is ridiculous!" Karen shrieked, her voice cracking under the strain. She took a shaky step back, her eyes darting between the officer and Marcus. "You're all taking his side. He's lying. He's manipulating you. All of you." Marcus, standing taller now despite the lingering sting in his eyes, met her gaze with unshakable calm. His voice was steady but carried a frigid edge. "No one's being manipulated," he said, his words cutting like ice. "You're just mad that your story doesn't hold up." Karen's breath hitched, and she thrust a trembling finger at him. "You don't get to talk to me like that. I'm the victim here. You're all against me because he knows how to play you." The officer raised a hand, his voice sharp and commanding. "Ma'am, I need you to calm down. We've seen enough to know this isn't what you're claiming." Karen let out a high-pitched laugh, verging on hysteria. "Calm down? Calm down? I was attacked. I felt unsafe. What else was I supposed to do? Not pepper spray someone returning your purse, for starters," muttered the young man holding his phone, still recording the escalating scene. Karen's head whipped toward him, her face contorted in rage. "You stop filming me! You don't have my permission!" she shrieked, her voice cracking under the weight of her fury. "Pretty sure I don't need it," the young man replied flatly, refusing to lower his phone. Marcus took a step closer, his gaze locked on Karen, unwavering. "You don't want people to see the truth, do you? You can't handle the fact that you're wrong." Karen's hands began to tremble violently, her grip on the pepper spray loosening slightly. "Shut up!" she screamed, her voice filled with desperation. "You don't get to talk to me like that. You're a liar, a thief." "Ma'am," the officer interrupted, his tone firm but steady. "Put the pepper spray down right now." Karen's wild eyes flicked to the officer, then to the crowd, which had turned visibly hostile toward her. Her breathing quickened, coming in frantic gasps as she tried to make sense of the situation. "You don't understand," she cried. "You weren't here. You didn't see the way he looked at me. He was coming after me." Marcus let out a sharp, exhausted exhale, his patience finally snapping. "I wasn't coming after you," he barked, his voice resonating with restrained anger. "I was standing there explaining myself while you painted me as a monster. And now that everyone sees the truth, you're falling apart." Karen's face twisted in fury, and she took an unsteady step toward him. The officer quickly moved between them, raising a hand to block her. "That's enough, ma'am," he said, his tone now steely. "Step back." Karen's voice broke into a sob, her words spilling out in an incoherent wail. "You can't do this to me. I'm not the criminal here. He is. Arrest him. He's the one who started all this." The officer shook his head, his expression firm. "Ma'am, you're not in a position to make demands. Put the pepper spray down and cooperate, or I'll have to arrest you for assault." Karen stumbled backward, clutching the canister even tighter as tears streamed down her face. Her words came out in frantic bursts. "You can't arrest me. I was scared. He was dangerous. I didn't do anything wrong." The officer stepped closer, his tone hardening further. "Ma'am, this is your last warning. Drop the pepper spray, or I'll have to place you under arrest." "No!" Karen shrieked, her entire body trembling with desperation. "You're ruining my life. He's ruining my life." The crowd murmured louder, the collective patience for Karen's theatrics rapidly eroding. "Just arrest her already," someone muttered from the back. Karen's eyes darted around the circle of faces, her panic boiling over into a crescendo of despair. "You're all against me. You don't know what it's like to feel this kind of fear. I'm the victim. Me." The officer moved closer, his hand hovering near his belt. "Ma'am," he said, his voice cold and unyielding, "if you don't comply, I'll have no choice but to restrain you." Karen's lip curled, her desperation morphing into raw defiance. She clutched the pepper spray tightly, her knuckles trembling. "You can't arrest me," she screamed. "I was protecting myself. You can't take me in." As the officer reached out, Karen jerked her arm away violently. The crowd collectively gasped, the tension boiling over as the officer's voice rose sharply. "Ma'am, stop resisting!" Karen flailed against his grip, her voice erupting into a piercing wail. "You're all against me! This isn't fair!" she screeched, her movements growing more frantic by the second. Marcus watched silently, his expression a mix of frustration and disbelief, as Karen's meltdown reached its peak. Her cries echoed through the park, a cacophony of anger and desperation. The officer, visibly losing patience, tightened his grip on her arm. His tone was sharp and final. "Ma'am, I'm telling you one last time, stop resisting." Karen twisted violently, her voice now guttural as tears streaked her flushed face. "No, you don't understand. I didn't do anything wrong. He's the one you should be arresting." The crowd's murmurs swelled, their disapproval of Karen's actions now unmistakable. "Just take her in already," someone muttered, their exasperation cutting through the noise. With a swift, practiced motion, the officer pulled Karen's arm behind her back and snapped the handcuffs into place. Her scream ripped through the air like a siren. "You can't do this to me. I'm the victim. He's dangerous." The officer, his voice now cold and unwavering, responded firmly. "Ma'am, you're under arrest for assault, resisting arrest, and filing a false report." The weight of the moment pressed down on Karen as the officer recited her Miranda rights. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford one, one will be provided for you. Do you understand these rights?" Karen's knees buckled slightly, and the officer steadied her. Her sobs devolved into incoherent babbling. "This isn't fair! You're ruining my life! You don't know what this will do to me." Marcus, who had been watching silently, finally spoke, his voice calm but cutting. "You did this to yourself, no one else." Karen's tear-streaked face twisted in rage as she turned toward him. "You shut up!" she screamed. "This is your fault. You set me up. You and all these people. You planned this, didn't you?" Marcus crossed his arms, his expression unmoved. "Yeah, because I spend all my free time planning to return lost purses and get pepper sprayed. Makes perfect sense." A soft chuckle rippled through the crowd at his sarcasm, further enraging Karen. "You think this is funny?" she spat, her voice hoarse and raw. "You'll regret this. All of you." "Enough," the officer interjected firmly, as he began steering her toward the patrol car. Karen resisted every step, her feet dragging along the pavement. "I'll sue all of you," she shouted, her voice cracking. "I'll ruin you. You'll see." As the officer opened the patrol car door and maneuvered her inside, Karen's cries turned guttural. "I'm innocent. You're all blind," she wailed, kicking wildly at the air before the door closed with a heavy thud. The crowd began to disperse, their murmurs a mix of relief and disbelief. A middle-aged woman pushing a stroller muttered, "Good riddance," as she walked away. The young man with the phone approached Marcus, holding the screen up. "This is already trending," he said, showing the video he'd uploaded to social media. "People are going to see what really happened." Marcus exhaled heavily, his shoulders sagging under the weight of the evening. "I appreciate it," he said, his tone weary. "It's just a lot to take in." The officer returned, his demeanor softening as he addressed Marcus. "Sir, are you all right? We can get you medical attention if you need it." Marcus shook his head. "I'll be fine. I just need a minute." The officer nodded but continued. "I still need you to come down to the station to file your statement. Are you pressing charges?" Marcus hesitated, his gaze following the patrol car as it disappeared down the street, Karen's muffled screams still faintly audible. Finally he spoke, his voice firm. "Yeah, she needs to face the consequences." "That's the right call," the officer said. "What she did was completely out of line." As the crowd thinned, a few bystanders approached Marcus to offer words of support. The woman with the stroller patted his arm gently. "You handled that well," she said. "Not sure I could have stayed so calm." Marcus managed a small, tired smile. "Thanks," he replied, though his voice carried no enthusiasm. The young man with the phone lingered, his expression serious. "Hey, if you need the video for your case or anything, just let me know. What she did to you wasn't right." Marcus nodded, his gratitude genuine. "I appreciate that. Really." As the last of the onlookers drifted away, The park grew eerily quiet, the earlier chaos replaced by an uneasy stillness. Marcus rubbed his eyes, the burn from the pepper spray still lingering, and let out a long, weary breath. Moments later, another patrol car pulled up to the park. A different officer stepped out, clipboard in hand. He approached Marcus, his expression professional but not unkind. "Are you Mr. Robinson?" Marcus nodded stiffly. "Yeah, that's me." The officer scanned his notes briefly before speaking. "We'll need you to come to the station to give a formal statement. Do you need a ride? Or can you get there on your own?" Marcus glanced at the few remaining onlookers. The young man with the phone gave him a thumbs up. "You good, man?" Marcus returned a faint nod, then turned to the officer. "I'll come with you." "All right," the officer said, leading him to the waiting patrol car. Marcus climbed into the back seat, his body sagging into the worn cushions as the door shut, with a definitive click. The ride to the station was quiet, save for the hum of the engine and the muted chatter over the police radio. Marcus stared out the window, watching the city lights blur into streaks of color as his thoughts churned. When they arrived, the station's fluorescent lights and sterile beige walls greeted him with an unsettling sense of normalcy. Marcus sat near the front desk, a paper cup of water in his hands as he waited. The faint sounds of officers typing, phones ringing, and muted conversations created a backdrop that felt oddly out of sync with the turmoil he'd just endured. After a few minutes, an officer approached him. "Mr. Robinson, we're ready for your statement. Follow me." Marcus stood, his legs stiff, and followed the officer into a small interview room. A metal table sat in the center with 2 chairs, and a recording device blinked steadily at the corner of the table. The officer gestured for him to sit and took the seat across from him. "Let's start from the beginning," the officer said, pen poised over a notepad. "Tell me what happened in the park." Marcus took a deep breath, collecting his thoughts. "I was walking home from work, and I saw a purse left on a—" Marcus sat stiffly in the small, stark room, his words steady but weighted as he recounted the incident. "I saw a purse on a bench with no one around, so I picked it up to return it. I noticed this woman, Karen, nearby, looking like she'd lost something, so I went over to her." The officer nodded, jotting down notes. "And then?" Marcus's jaw tightened as he continued. "I tried to give it to her, but before I could explain, she snatched it from me and started accusing me of stealing. She didn't even let me speak, just started yelling and throwing out accusations." "What kind of accusations?" the officer asked, his tone calm but inquisitive. Marcus exhaled sharply, the memory still raw. "She said things like, 'you people' and 'your type.' You know what she meant." The officer's pen paused briefly before resuming its steady movements across the notepad. "Go on." "I tried to explain that I found the purse, but she wouldn't listen. She called me a thief, and when I told her she was wrong, she pulled out pepper spray and hit me with it. I didn't touch her or even raise my voice until she attacked me." The officer nodded, his expression growing sterner. "And what happened after that?" Marcus shrugged slightly, exhaustion creeping into his voice. "The crowd got involved. Some people defended me, others didn't. She called the police and made it sound like I attacked her. But when the first officer arrived, the truth came out because of the video and the witnesses." The officer tapped his pen thoughtfully against the pad. "I've reviewed the footage we received, and your account aligns perfectly with what we've seen. This is an open and shut case against her." Marcus nodded but remained quiet, the emotional weight of the ordeal still pressing on him. "Pressing charges was the right move," the officer continued. "We've already filed for assault, filing a false report, and resisting arrest. She'll be arraigned tomorrow." Marcus leaned back slightly in his chair, letting out a weary breath. "What happens next?" "She'll go through the legal process. Given the evidence, she's likely to face significant penalties. You may need to testify, but with the video and witnesses, your case is strong." Marcus rubbed his temples, the tension in his body easing slightly. "I'll do what I have to." The officer stood, gathering his notes. "That's all we need for now. You're free to go, but we'll contact you if we need anything further." As Marcus left the interview room, his thoughts swirled in exhaustion. He was surprised to see the young man with the phone still waiting in the lobby. The man raised a hand in greeting as Marcus approached. "Hey, man," he said, his tone casual but concerned. "Just wanted to make sure you're all right. That video is already blowing up online." People are going to see what really happened. Marcus managed a tired smile. Thanks for sticking around. I appreciate it. The young man nodded firmly. People need to know about stuff like this. Don't let her get away with it. I won't, Marcus replied, his voice steady. He stepped outside into the cool night air, letting it wash over him. It was a small relief after the turmoil of the evening, but his resolve to see justice through remained firm. Meanwhile, Karen sat in a dimly lit holding cell, her trembling hands resting in her lap, where the cuffs had recently been removed. Her once meticulously styled hair was now disheveled, and streaks of dried tears marred her makeup. The muted sounds of officers moving through the halls and the occasional murmur of other detainees filled the air. Without her phone, confiscated during her arrest, Karen was cut off from the outside world. She could only imagine the fallout, though the sinking feeling in her chest told her it was worse than she could fathom. Outside the station, the viral video continued to spread like wildfire. Clips of Karen's shrill accusations, her unprovoked pepper spray attack, and her emotional meltdown flooded social media. Memes and commentary painted her as the epitome of entitlement and racial bias. At her workplace, the consequences were swift. Karen's manager, Amanda, received dozens of emails and calls from colleagues, clients, and strangers demanding action. One coworker forwarded the video with the subject line, "Is this Karen from accounting?" Amanda watched the video with a growing sense of disbelief and frustration. By the end, she sighed heavily, picked up her phone, and called HR. "We need to talk," she said curtly. At home, Karen's husband sat on their couch, staring at his phone in shock. His social media feed was flooded with tags, private messages, and reposts of the video. Friends and acquaintances bombarded him with questions. "Is this your wife? What the hell happened? Did Karen really do this?" The comments were even harsher. Classic Karen behavior, entitled and racist. "This woman belongs in jail for what she did. I hope that guy sues her for everything she has." He buried his face in his hands, the weight of public opinion crushing him. Glancing at the door, he half expected Karen to walk in and explain herself, but he knew she wouldn't, not tonight. Back at the station, Karen was called into a small room where a public defender sat waiting. His demeanor was professional but detached as he slid a folder across the table. "Ms. Miller," he began, his voice measured, "I've reviewed the charges against you and the evidence. It doesn't look good." Karen's hands balled into fists, her jaw tightening. "You don't understand," she snapped. "I was scared. That man, he was yelling at me, and I panicked. I didn't mean for any of this to happen." The lawyer adjusted his glasses, his tone unchanging. "The video evidence contradicts your account. It shows Mr. Robinson calmly trying to return your purse while you escalated the situation. Your use of pepper spray was unprovoked." Karen's face flushed red as she leaned forward, her voice trembling. "You weren't there. You didn't, but it did," Greg said, his tone steady yet unyielding. "And now we're all dealing with the consequences. This isn't just about you anymore, Karen. It's about everyone you've affected. Me, your co-workers, even strangers who are outraged by what they saw. You crossed a line, and you need to face that." Karen's hands gripped the back of the chair so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Her breathing grew erratic, a mixture of frustration and panic bubbling to the surface. "You think I don't know that?" she screamed, her voice cracking. "You think I don't feel the whole world crashing down on me? I was scared, Greg. I was trying to protect myself." Greg shook his head slowly, his disappointment palpable. "Being scared doesn't justify what you did. You attacked a man who was trying to help you, and now the whole world sees you for who you really are. I don't know how we come back from this." Karen's lips quivered as tears welled up in her eyes, her defenses breaking down. "So, what? You're just going to abandon me like everyone else?" she asked, her voice trembling. "You're supposed to support me. You're my husband." Greg sighed deeply, pinching the bridge of his nose again before responding. "I'm still here, aren't I? But you have to understand, Karen, you didn't just ruin your own life. You dragged me down with you. I didn't choose this, and I sure as hell didn't sign up for it." Karen's legs buckled slightly, and she slumped into the chair, burying her face in her hands. Her sobs filled the silence of the room, a stark contrast to Greg's stoic presence. He stood in the doorway for a moment longer before quietly walking away, leaving Karen alone with her thoughts. Meanwhile, across town, Marcus sat at his kitchen table, his coffee growing cold as he mulled over the conversation with Mark Bennett, the civil rights lawyer. The idea of filing a civil suit against Karen lingered in his mind. It wasn't about revenge. It was about accountability. Yet, a part of him hesitated. He didn't want his life to become defined by this one moment, no matter how unjust it was. His phone buzzed, pulling him from his thoughts. Another message from the young man who filmed the video popped up. "People are really rallying behind you. You've got a lot of support out here. Let me know if you need anything." Marcus managed a faint smile, grateful for the solidarity, but he couldn't shake the weight of the situation. He opened his messages and scrolled through countless offers for legal assistance, media interviews, and words of encouragement. It was overwhelming, and despite the outpouring of support, he still felt the lingering sting of being reduced to a viral moment. He glanced at Bennett's card on the table, his mind replaying the lawyer's words. "You didn't ask for this, but you have the opportunity to turn it into something bigger." Marcus leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. He wasn't sure what his next step would be, but one thing was certain. He wouldn't let this moment define him. Karen's world continued to crumble. The morning news cycle relentlessly dissected her actions, with pundits debating issues of privilege, entitlement, and racial bias. Headlines like "Pepper Spray Karen Faces Backlash" and "Viral Video Sparks National Conversation on Profiling" dominated social media. Her workplace publicly announced her suspension, citing her actions as a violation of the company's ethical standards. By midday, Karen received the dreaded email. Subject: termination of employment. The email was clinical and detached, stating that her behavior was inconsistent with the company's core values. Karen read the message 3 times, the words blurring together as her breath hitched. Finally, she slammed her laptop shut, letting out a guttural scream into the suffocating silence of her now empty home. The fallout reached far beyond Karen's professional life. Friends and neighbors distanced themselves, many openly condemning her actions. Her social media accounts were flooded with backlash, messages ranging from criticism to outright hostility. Her husband, Greg, grew increasingly distant, their once comfortable life now overshadowed by the public spectacle. That evening, Karen sat in the dimly lit living room, her head in her hands. The lawyer's words from earlier echoed in her mind. "You need to show genuine remorse." But Karen wasn't ready to accept that. She clung to her version of events, the one where she was the victim, even as the evidence and public opinion painted a different picture. Yet, deep down, a gnawing sense of guilt began to take root, small and persistent, refusing to be ignored. As the sun set, casting long shadows across the walls, Karen stared at her reflection in the darkened window. The woman staring back at her was no longer the composed, confident person she once prided herself on being. That version of Karen was gone, and all that remained was the consequence of her actions. In the days that followed, the story continued to dominate headlines, sparking broader conversations about accountability, privilege, and systemic bias. Marcus's decision about the civil suit loomed, but he remained focused on reclaiming his sense of normalcy, determined to move forward with dignity and purpose. Karen, however, was left to reckon with the fallout of her actions, a harsh reminder that choices have consequences and the truth, no matter how inconvenient, always finds a way to surface. This isn't just for you, Mr. Robinson. It's for everyone who's ever been in a situation like yours, but didn't have the witnesses or the evidence to prove their innocence. Your case sets a precedent. It shows that behavior like Karen's won't be tolerated. David nodded, the weight of Mark's words sinking in. He closed the folder and exhaled deeply, the enormity of the situation pressing down on him. "I understand," he said finally. "Let's do this." Mark extended his hand across the desk, his expression resolute. "We'll fight this together. You're not alone in this. The next few days were a whirlwind. News of the lawsuit dominated headlines and social media. Clips of the original confrontation were reshared alongside details of the civil suit, with commentators applauding David's decision to pursue justice. Hashtags like #News Justice for David and Hold Her Accountable trended across platforms, drawing even more public attention. Karen, on the other hand, was drowning in the fallout. Her phone buzzed with an unrelenting stream of notifications, each one more scathing than the last. Messages from strangers berated her, calling her entitled, racist, and a danger to society. Memes mocking her outburst and labeling her Pepper Spray Karen flooded her feeds. Sitting alone in her living room, Karen stared blankly at the screen of her phone, her hands trembling. The once mundane comfort of her home now felt oppressive, each room a reminder of her unraveling life. Greg's words from earlier replayed in her mind. You brought this on yourself. Her desperation was mounting. Karen knew she needed a lawyer, someone who could turn the tide in her favor. She began making frantic calls, her voice cracking with every conversation. Most lawyers she contacted declined, citing the overwhelming public evidence against her. Finally, one agreed to meet, though their tone was far from reassuring. Karen arrived at the law office the next day, disheveled and visibly frazzled. The attorney, a stern woman in her late 40s, greeted her with a professional but detached demeanor. Ms. Miller, the lawyer began, gesturing for her to sit. I've reviewed the details of your case, and I'll be honest, this is going to be an uphill battle. The video evidence alone is damning, not to mention the eyewitness accounts. Karen's hands gripped the edge of the chair as she leaned forward, her voice desperate. But he's exaggerating. He's turning everyone against me. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. The lawyer raised an eyebrow, her tone unyielding. Intent matters in some cases, but not here. Your actions were recorded, and they speak louder than your words. The court will see this as a clear case of assault and defamation. Karen's breath hitched. So, what am I supposed to do? Just give up? The lawyer leaned back, folding her arms. That's up to you. You can fight this, but it will likely cost you more than you're willing to pay, financially and emotionally. Or you can settle and try to mitigate the damage. Either way, you need to start thinking about how you're going to take responsibility for your actions. Karen stared at the lawyer, her mind racing. Responsibility. The word felt foreign to her, but she couldn't ignore its weight. She left the office without a clear plan, her thoughts spiraling as she returned to her increasingly chaotic world. David, meanwhile, continued to navigate the storm of attention with quiet determination. Mark worked tirelessly to prepare their case, keeping David updated at every step. Interviews and media appearances became a regular part of David's routine, though he approached them with measured restraint. He didn't want to be seen as seeking fame, only justice. One evening, as David scrolled through his messages, he paused on a comment that struck a chord. It read, "Thank you for standing up. What you're doing matters." David set his phone down, his resolve solidifying. This wasn't just about him anymore, it was about something bigger. The day of the preliminary hearing arrived, and the courtroom buzzed with quiet murmurs as both parties took their places. Karen sat stiffly at the defendant's table, her face pale and drawn. Across the room, David sat beside Mark, his expression calm but focused. The judge entered, and the room fell silent. As the proceedings began, Karen's lawyer argued that her actions were a result of fear and panic. But Mark countered with precision, presenting the video evidence and eyewitness accounts that painted a clear picture of Karen's escalation and unjustified aggression. When the video was played in court, the room grew tense. Karen's voice, shrill and accusatory, echoed through the chamber. The footage of her pepper-spraying David without provocation left little room for doubt. The judge's expression remained neutral, but their words at the end of the hearing were firm. Based on the evidence presented, this case will proceed to trial. As the hearing concluded, Karen avoided making eye contact with anyone as she hurried out of the courtroom. David, on the other hand, stood tall, his resolve unwavering. Outside, reporters swarmed, their cameras capturing every moment. David gave a brief statement, his voice measured. "This isn't about revenge. It's about accountability. I hope this case sends a message that actions have consequences." In the days that followed, public support for David continued to grow, while Karen became a cautionary tale of entitlement and prejudice. Her life, once meticulously curated, now lay in ruins, the consequences of her actions forcing her to confront the reality she had tried so desperately to deny. David, however, began to find peace. While the road ahead was still uncertain, he knew he had done the right thing, not just for himself, but for others who had faced similar injustices. In standing up, he had turned his pain into a platform for change, proving that even in the face of adversity, justice could prevail. David sat back, his mind racing as he processed Mark's words. He glanced toward Karen, slumped in her seat, her defiance seemingly extinguished. For a brief moment, he felt a pang of sympathy. Her life had unraveled entirely, but it was overshadowed by the memory of the humiliation, pain, and injustice he'd endured. This wasn't just about him. It was about sending a clear message that prejudice and aggression would have consequences. David leaned in, his voice steady but firm. "Let's push for a revised settlement. I'm not here to ruin her life, but I'm also not letting her off lightly." Mark nodded, a hint of approval in his expression. He rose to address the court. "Your Honor, my client is open to discussing a revised settlement. However, it must reflect the seriousness of the harm caused and the accountability necessary in this case." The judge nodded, her gaze shifting to Karen and her lawyer. "Miss Miller, this is your opportunity to resolve this matter without further escalation. Do you wish to proceed with a revised settlement?" Karen hesitated, her face pale and her hands gripping the table. Her lawyer leaned in, whispering urgently, before she finally nodded. "Yes, Your Honor," she said, her voice trembling. "I'll agree to a revised settlement." The judge's gavel struck, signaling a temporary recess for both parties to discuss terms. David and Mark stepped out of the courtroom into a private conference room, where Karen and her lawyer joined them. The atmosphere was tense, the silence punctuated by the occasional rustle of papers. Mark broke the silence. "Given the evidence and the circumstances, we're proposing a settlement of $200,000 to cover emotional distress, reputational harm, and punitive damages. This reflects the severity of Miss Miller's actions and the impact they've had on my client." Karen's lawyer glanced at her, his expression grave. "It's a significant sum, but it's likely less than what a trial could result in, considering the evidence against you." Karen's face crumpled, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't have that kind of money." Mark's gaze didn't waver. "Then it may be time to consider alternative arrangements. Payment plans or other forms of restitution can be negotiated, but the accountability remains non-negotiable." Karen looked to her lawyer, then back at David. Her eyes glistened with unshed tears, her defiance giving way to resignation. "Fine," she said hoarsely. "I'll settle." The agreement was finalized that afternoon, with both parties signing off on the terms. The settlement included a formal, public apology from Karen, in addition to the financial compensation. As the documents were signed, Karen avoided David's gaze, her hand trembling as she wrote her name on the line. When it was over, David stood, extending his hand toward Karen. She hesitated before taking it, her grip weak. "I'm sorry," she whispered, though her voice lacked conviction. David nodded, his expression calm but unreadable. "I hope you learn from this." The news of the settlement spread quickly, with headlines highlighting Karen's apology and the significant financial restitution. While the public's interest gradually shifted to other stories, David found a sense of closure. The experience had been harrowing, but it had also given him a platform to advocate for change. In the weeks that followed, David returned to his routine, seeking solace in the familiar comforts of his community center. Though his life would never return to the way it was before, he felt stronger, more grounded, and determined to use his voice for good. Karen, on the other hand, faced a long road of rebuilding. The settlement drained her financially, and her public reputation remained in tatters. For the first time, she began to reflect on the choices that had led her here. The world no longer revolved around her perspective. and the weight of accountability was a heavy but necessary burden. Months later, David stood on the stage of the community center, addressing a group of young adults gathered for a workshop on standing up against prejudice. His voice carried through the room, steady and resolute. "We all have a responsibility to hold ourselves and others accountable," he said. "It's not easy, and it's not always fair, but it's necessary. Change starts with us." As the crowd erupted into applause, David felt a sense of peace. He hadn't just found justice, he'd found purpose, and with that, he knew he could truly move forward. Expression, a mixture of tension and exhaustion, her eyes fixed on the table in front of her. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation, the weight of the moment palpable. David sat beside Mark, his posture straight, his resolve unwavering as the judge began to speak. This court is now back in session to finalize the resolution of Robinson versus Miller. Both parties have reached an agreement, and we will now proceed to formalize the settlement terms. The judge glanced at Karen. "Miss Miller, you have agreed to provide a verbal apology to Mr. Robinson in open court. This is your opportunity to demonstrate sincerity and take full responsibility for your actions." Karen hesitated, her hands gripping the edges of the table. Her lawyer gave her a subtle nudge, urging her to stand. Slowly, she rose to her feet, her face pale and her voice unsteady. "Mr. Robinson," she began, her tone flat at first, but as she continued, cracks of emotion broke through. "I want to apologize for my actions that day in the park. I made assumptions about you that were unfair and wrong. I allowed my fear and prejudice to cloud my judgment, and I deeply regret the harm I caused you." She paused, her hands trembling before continuing. "I know that my actions have hurt not only you, but also others who have seen what I did. I'm sorry for the pain, humiliation, and injustice I put you through. I take responsibility for what I've done, and I'll work to do better." The room was silent as Karen sat back down, her hands shaking as she clasped them in her lap. The judge nodded, her gaze shifting to David. "Mr. Robinson, do you wish to respond?" David stood, his voice calm but resolute. "Thank you, Your Honor. Miss Miller, I accept your apology. I hope this experience teaches all of us the importance of treating each other with respect and understanding, no matter who we are or where we come from." He took a steadying breath before continuing. "This case was never about destroying your life. It was about accountability, about showing that actions have consequences. I hope you use this opportunity to reflect and grow." The judge's expression softened slightly as she addressed the room. "This court commends both parties for reaching a resolution. Let this case serve as a reminder that prejudice and injustice have no place in our society. The settlement terms will now be recorded, and this case is concluded." The gavel struck one final time, and the room exhaled collectively as the tension lifted. Reporters outside the courthouse scrambled to file their stories, cameras flashing as people exited. Outside, David stood on the courthouse steps, the cool air brushing against his face. Mark stood beside him, his expression one of quiet satisfaction. Reporters crowded around, but David raised a hand to silence them. "I want to thank everyone for their support," he said, his voice clear and steady. "This case was about more than just me. It was about standing up to prejudice and holding people accountable for their actions. I hope it inspires others to do the same." As the crowd murmured in agreement, David turned and walked down the steps, leaving the chaos of the courthouse behind. His steps were lighter, his resolve stronger. He hadn't just won a case, he'd made a difference. Karen, meanwhile, left the courthouse through a side exit, avoiding the throng of reporters. The weight of the settlement and the public apology sat heavily on her shoulders. She knew her journey to rebuild her life would be long and arduous, but for the first time she understood that this was the price of accountability, a lesson she had no choice but to learn. In the weeks that followed, the case sparked widespread conversations about accountability, prejudice, and systemic bias. David used his platform to advocate for change, speaking at community events and sharing his story to inspire others. His life was far from back to normal, but he felt a renewed sense of purpose. Karen, now a symbol of the consequences of unchecked prejudice, faced the slow process of rebuilding her life. The public's judgment was harsh, but it forced her to confront the reality of her actions and begin the difficult work of self-reflection. In the end, justice was served, not just for David, but for the countless others who had experienced similar injustices. And while the road ahead remained uncertain, one thing was clear: change was possible, and it started with accountability. David sat in the dim light of his apartment, the newspaper spread across the table. The op-ed, titled "Accountability in Action: The Robinson Case and What It Means for Us All," had captured his attention. As he read each word, the weight of the journey he had endured became clear. The piece described him as a figure of quiet strength, someone who had turned an act of blatant injustice into a moment of societal reflection. He chuckled softly, shaking his head. "All this," he murmured, the irony of it all not lost on him. The court case had come to an end earlier that day, but the ripples of its impact were still being felt. The settlement, $1,000 and a public verbal apology, wasn't about the monetary amount. For David, it was about the acknowledgement of wrongdoing and the message it sent. Prejudice and bias had real consequences. As the courtroom cleared, David remained seated for a moment, watching as Karen slumped in her chair. Her apology had been delivered, trembling and halting, but the words had been spoken. She admitted to letting fear and prejudice guide her actions and apologized for the harm she caused. While David accepted the terms, he couldn't ignore the resentment lingering in her tone, a battle between her forced accountability and internal resistance. Mark Bennett had been by his side every step of the way, and now, outside the courthouse, he offered a firm handshake. "Well done," Mark said, his voice filled with respect. "You handled this with grace. What you've done here will resonate far beyond this courtroom." David nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Thanks, Mark. I just hope it makes a difference." The media frenzy outside was relentless. Reporters swarmed the courthouse steps, microphones and cameras trained on David as he exited. Mark guided him through the throng, fielding questions and deflecting more invasive ones. "Mr. Robinson, how do you feel about the resolution?" one reporter called out, her voice cutting through the noise. David paused, turning to face her. His voice was calm but firm. "I'm relieved it's over, and I'm hopeful this case sends a clear message. No one should be treated the way I was. I hope this makes people think twice about their assumptions and actions." As Mark ushered him toward a waiting car, another reporter shouted, "What's next for you, Mr. Robinson?" David hesitated for a moment, then replied, "I'm going to keep doing what I've always done, helping people and standing up for what's right. That doesn't change." Karen, meanwhile, slipped out of a side entrance with her lawyer, avoiding the reporters entirely. Her face was ashen as she climbed into the back seat of her husband Greg's car. The atmosphere inside was heavy, the silence deafening. Greg's expression was grim, his knuckles white against the steering wheel as he navigated through the city streets. Karen stared out the window, her mind racing. The public apology, the settlement, the humiliation. It was all too much. She had always thought of herself as a good person, someone who had earned her place in the world. But now, she was forced to confront the truth. Her actions had revealed a side of herself she had spent years ignoring. "You're going to have to figure out how to move forward from this," Greg said flatly, breaking the silence. "Not just for us, but for yourself." Karen didn't respond. For the first time in her life, she realized she had no idea how to begin. David returned to the community center later that afternoon. The familiar hum of activity grounded him, the bustling energy of the space, a reminder of the work that still needed to be done. Maria greeted him at the door, her smile warm and curious. "How'd it go?" she asked gently. "It's done," David replied, his expression thoughtful. "She apologized, and we settled." Maria nodded, her tone understanding. "And how do you feel?" David paused, considering her question. "I feel like it was worth it," he said finally. "Not just for me, but for everyone who's been through something like this and didn't get the chance to fight back." Maria smiled, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "You did good, David. You really did." As he walked through the bustling center, the noise and energy of the space filled him with a renewed sense of purpose. He didn't know what the future held, but for now, he was content to move forward, knowing he had done his part to make things a little better. In the weeks following the court settlement, the frenzy around the case began to fade, though its lessons lingered in the public consciousness. News outlets covered the resolution sparingly, focusing more on the precedent it set than on Karen's personal downfall. David found peace in returning to his routines. One quiet evening, as he read the op-ed about his case, he realized the significance of his actions. The public might see him as a symbol of justice, but for him, it was about something simpler: doing the right thing. Karen, on the other hand, faced a long and uncertain path. Her public humiliation and financial loss were heavy burdens, but they forced her to reflect on the choices that led her here. For the first time, she began to confront the biases that had shaped her actions, though the road to redemption was long and unclear. The Robinson case became a landmark moment, a reminder that accountability matters, that assumptions have consequences, and that even small acts of justice can ripple far beyond their origins. For David, it wasn't about revenge or fame. It was about standing up, not just for himself, but for everyone who had been judged unfairly. And in doing so, he proved that change starts with courage, one step at a time. Across town, Karen sat at her modest dining table, staring at the stacks of bills and legal paperwork scattered before her. The $150,000 settlement loomed over her like a storm cloud, a constant reminder of the choices that had led her here. Her once upscale home had been sold, her luxury car gone, traded for a used sedan to free up funds for the payout. The financial strain was suffocating, forcing her to reevaluate every aspect of her life. Each check she wrote to settle her debt to David felt like a tiny act of self-destruction. The irony wasn't lost on her. The man she had falsely accused of stealing her purse was now the recipient of her financial penance. But rather than confront the lessons her situation offered, Karen clung tightly to her bitterness, replaying the events in her mind, altering the narrative to absolve herself. It was easier to blame others, David, the court, even the media, than to face the truth about her actions. At the community center, David was immersed in his work. The halls were alive again with the laughter of kids he mentored, their energy filling the space with hope and purpose. The case had been a defining chapter in his life, but David refused to let it define him entirely. He had moved on, reclaiming the rhythm of his daily life, but the impact of what he'd accomplished lingered. One evening, as David finished packing up after a long day, Maria approached him, her smile sly and teasing. "You've seen the latest, haven't you?" she asked, holding out her phone. David raised an eyebrow. "What now?" Maria handed over her phone, which displayed a social media post from a local news outlet. The post detailed Karen's financial struggles, highlighting her decision to sell belongings and downsize her lifestyle to fulfill the terms of the settlement. The accompanying headline read, "Pepper Spray, Karen faces financial fallout from lawsuit settlement. She's basically spent all the money she thought you were stealing," Maria quipped, her tone light but pointed. David chuckled, a deep and genuine laugh that he hadn't felt in weeks. "Life's got a funny way of balancing things out, doesn't it?" Maria nodded, her smile widening. "Sure does. But you made it happen, David. You didn't just let it slide. You stood up for yourself. And for a lot of other people who've been through the same thing." David's laughter faded into a soft smile, a quiet sense of pride settling in. "Yeah," he said thoughtfully, "I guess I did." As David walked home that evening, the cool breeze carried a sense of closure. The stars above glimmered faintly, and the streets were peaceful. He didn't feel anger or resentment anymore, only relief. The fight for justice had been long and painful, but it had been worth every moment. He had stood up for himself, and in doing so, he had become a voice for others who had faced similar injustices. Karen, he realized, might never fully understand the harm she had caused. Her bitterness and refusal to reflect on her actions were burdens she would have to carry alone. But that wasn't his responsibility. He had done his part to hold her accountable, and he had moved forward. As David turned onto his street, A faint smile spread across his face. The weight that had rested on his shoulders for so long seemed to lift, carried away by the night breeze. Life, he thought, had a way of sorting things out in its own time. And as he stepped into the warmth of his home, he felt a peace he hadn't known in months. For the first time in a long while, he could breathe freely, knowing he had done what was right, not just for himself, but for the countless others who needed a reminder that standing up for justice was always worth it.